Whenever someone gets pregnant, a metaphorical coin toss takes place that can have massive consequences for the parents, particularly for the mother. Will the baby be a boy, or will it be a girl? The consequences of this coin toss go far beyond what you'll name the child or any other common parenting choices. In the UK, if the baby is a girl, the drop in mother's earnings is more than 8 times larger than if it's a boy. And it's not only the woman's career that's affected. Mental health, relationship satisfaction, and even the political views of the parents can be affected by whether the child is a boy or a girl. This isn't because of biology, it's because of how parents respond to having a girl. Things like who takes on the late night feeds, who cuts back on work hours, and who shoulders more of the household responsibilities. In this video, we'll look at how researchers uncovered this daughter penalty, why it might happen, and what it could mean not just for the parents today, but also for the next generation growing up in these households. Welcome to Econ Unpacked. You may have heard, or even just assumed, that having a child negatively impacts mothers' earnings. And you'd be right. For instance, in the UK, mothers earn around 44% less than fathers with similar characteristics in the 5 years after birth, and they're about 30% less likely to be in paid work. Fathers, on the other hand, see almost no drop in earnings or employment. This isn't just a UK thing either. Studies from across Europe and North America show similar patterns, though the size of the penalty varies from country to country. In countries like Denmark or Sweden, where family policies are more supportive, the drop in mothers' earnings is smaller, but it doesn't entirely go away. These findings are what economists call the child penalty, but the study we're focusing on today goes a step further. Instead of just asking whether parenthood matters, it asks whether the gender of the first child matters too. A natural experiment. But how can we be sure that the child penalty even exists? Surely we can't just take the average income of mothers and compare it to the average income of women who never had a child. It'd be reasonable to assume that those women who have children might be quite different from those who don't have children. People who become parents might already be different in terms of their education, their career ambitions, their financial priorities, or even their health, and those differences could explain at least part of the gap, even if having a child had no effect at all. This is a problem called selection bias. The groups you're comparing are different in ways that matter, so you can't be sure that the differences you see are caused by the treatment. In this case, the treatment is having a child. So instead of simply comparing parents and non-parents, economists try to isolate the causal effect of the treatment, rather than just looking at correlations. The causal effect of a treatment is what economists call a treatment effect. One idea is the average treatment effect, or the ATE. Imagine you could somehow take every adult in the world who doesn't have a child, and split them into 2 groups. You then force half of them to have a child, and ensure that the other half do not have children. The ATE would be the average difference between those 2 groups. Doing this would obviously raise some pretty serious ethical issues, so in economics we often have to settle for the average treatment effect on the treated, or the ATT. This just means that we take the people who were treated, in this case who had a child, and ask what would have happened to them if they didn't have a child. Of course this doesn't tell us what the average effect on the population as a whole would have been, but it's a more relevant question for understanding the real world impact on the people who are actually affected. We still can't compare what a specific person who had a child's life would have been like if they or their partner hadn't gotten pregnant. In other words, we can't observe person A both with and without a child during the same time period, for example, while they are 25 to 30. So economists look for what's called a natural experiment. This is some real-world situation that divides people into treatment and control groups in a way that's close to random. One clever example from other research uses IVF treatment. They compare women who undergo IVF and succeed in having a baby with those who try but fail. Both groups wanted children, both went through the same process, the only difference is whether the treatment worked. That gets you much closer to the true causal effect of having a child. But unfortunately this isn't perfect either. IVF can be emotionally and physically demanding, and it also costs a small fortune. This, among other reasons, means that IVF only applies to a small subset of parents. This means that you can't use the IVF trick to study the effect on a large, representative group of parents or would-be parents. Luckily for the researchers that wrote the paper that we're focusing on today, they could take a different approach, one that's actually cleaner for this question. Instead of comparing parents to non-parents, it compares parents to other parents. The only difference between them is whether their firstborn child was a boy or a girl. Why is that useful? Well, because in the UK and in most high-income countries without widespread sex-selective abortion, the gender of your first child is essentially random. You cannot choose it. There's no meaningful difference between couples who have a boy first and those who have a girl first, at least not before the birth. The researchers tested this. They checked dozens of characteristics like education, income, relationship status, even mental health, and found almost no difference between the 2 groups before the baby arrived. The only minor imbalance was in the proportion with university degrees, which they then controlled for in their analysis. Statistically, this is exactly what we'd expect from pure chance. Because the firstborn gender is random, any differences we see after the birth can be treated as if they were the result of a coin toss. By following thousands of parents over time, the researchers could see exactly how earnings, employment, and hours worked changed in the years before and after the birth, and whether those changes were bigger when the firstborn was a girl. What they found was that in the 5 years after birth, mothers of firstborn sons earned about 3% less than fathers with similar background characteristics. But for mothers of firstborn daughters, that gap was 26%. Employment showed the same trend. Mothers of boys were about 6% less likely to be in work than fathers. For mothers of girls, it was 20%. And even among those still employed, mothers of daughters worked slightly fewer hours on average than mothers of sons. Fathers, on the other hand, saw almost no change in their earnings or employment, regardless of whether they had a boy or a girl. The daughter penalty was a mother-specific phenomenon, and it didn't fade away over the course of the study. It was there immediately after birth and still visible at least 5 years later. It's worth noting here that the study doesn't just compare each mother to her partner. These are the average effects across all mothers and all fathers, adjusting for their background characteristics. It's not a couple by couple comparison. If you're enjoying the video so far, consider subscribing. I should have more videos like this coming out soon. Anyway, back to the daughter penalty. So, we've established that mothers of firstborn girls in the UK see a far bigger drop in earnings and employment than mothers of firstborn boys. But what's actually causing this? The baby's not bringing home a payslip, they're not handing out career advice. So the explanation must lie in how parents respond to that first child's arrival, and how those responses differ depending on whether the baby is a boy or a girl. These are called mechanisms. These are the pathways that link cause and effect. And in this study, the researchers look at a whole range of them. Housework, childcare, attitudes, family size, relationship satisfaction, and mental health. Let's start with household specialisation and childcare. On average, mothers already do more housework and childcare than fathers, but after the first child is born, that gap widens, and it widens more if the firstborn is a girl. For example, after a boy, the gap between mothers and fathers in the share of household chores that they mostly do themselves jumps by 27%. After a girl, it jumps by 43%. It's the same for childcare. Mothers of boys are about 57% more likely than fathers to describe themselves as the main carer. For mothers of girls, it's 67%. Compared to the other stats, that might not sound huge, but in this context, a 10% difference is big, and it's statistically significant. This extra load at home is a pretty obvious candidate for why mothers of girls are more likely to cut back on work, reduce hours, or step away from the labour market entirely. Then there's attitudes and values. The researchers also track changes in parents' views on gender roles, political leanings, and even the kind of news that they consume. Interestingly, after having a daughter, mothers on average become less progressive on gender equality measures than after having a son. They measured this by asking parents whether they agree or disagree with statements like, "the husband should earn and the wife should stay at home." They also found that mothers of daughters were more likely to shift towards more conservative news sources. It's not that everyone who has a daughter suddenly turns into a tradwife, but on average, the birth of a daughter is linked to a small but measurable move towards more traditional attitudes. And those attitudes can feed back into household decisions about work and childcare. Next is family size. Parents of daughters are more likely to have a second child within 5 years. That's not unique to the UK, it's been documented in places as different as India and the US. The reasons for this vary, but often there's a preference for having at least one boy. More children can mean more pressure for one parent, usually the mother, to specialise in homemaking, and this could reinforce the other patterns that we've already seen. What about relationships and well-being? Well, interestingly, the study finds that fathers of daughters report higher relationship satisfaction than fathers of sons. For mothers, relationship quality doesn't seem to depend on the child's gender, but unfortunately, that's not true for mental health. Mothers of daughters tend to suffer a larger drop in mental health scores after birth than mothers of sons. Meanwhile, the mental health of fathers barely changes. That mental strain can make it harder to stay engaged in the labour market or to push for career progression, even if they do continue to work. If we add all of that up, what we see is the following. When the first child is a girl, households tend to adopt a more traditional division of labour. Mothers shoulder more of the chores and childcare, become more likely to be the main carer, and sometimes shift towards more traditional gender attitudes. They're also more likely to have another child soon, which amplifies this pattern. Fathers' careers go largely unchanged, and their reported satisfaction with the relationship increases, while the mother's mental health worsens. None of these factors can fully explain the daughter penalty, and it's not clear which mechanisms happen first and how they interact with each other. But together, they create an environment where it's harder for mothers of girls to maintain the same career trajectory as mothers of boys. As you can imagine, the effects of what we've discussed so far are not confined to the parents. The kids growing up in these households are likely to be affected too. So, an important question to ask is, are these gender norms passed from one generation to the next? This is called the intergenerational transmission of norms. The intergenerational transmission of norms are the values, expectations, and habits that get passed from one generation to the next. From this UK data, we can see that firstborn girls were more likely to grow up in households where the mother did more of the domestic work and the dad did less, and parental attitudes on gender roles were slightly more traditional. Even small differences, repeated day after day, become part of the culture that children grow up in. Why does this matter? Well, because other research suggests that children who grow up in more traditional households are, on average, more likely to replicate those patterns as adults in the jobs they pursue, the roles they take on in relationships, and the expectations that they have for their own partners. Therefore, if those norms get reinforced in childhood and passed on to the children's children, the effects can continue for decades, affecting not just the parents' careers, but the career paths of their children, and maybe even their grandchildren. It's important to recognise that the findings we discussed so far may not be generalisable to all situations. This is called the external validity of a study. The first obvious limitation is the geographical scope. This study is based on parents in the UK, and while the exact size of the daughter penalty elsewhere is unknown, there's plenty of research on the child penalty in other countries. Studies show that the child penalty varies with cultural norms and with family policies like subsidised childcare or parental leave. Therefore, it's likely that the daughter penalty also depends on cultural norms and family policies. In fact, when I emailed one of the authors of this study, he said that a good way to reduce the daughter penalty is to reduce the child penalty. Policies like well-designed parental leave, high-quality universal childcare, and broader shifts in gender norms have already been shown to reduce the child penalty, and if that shrinks, the daughter penalty will shrink along with it. Second, there's the issue of time horizons. The study follows parents for at least 5 years after their first birth, and the gaps don't disappear in that period. But we can't say much about what happens 10 or 20 years later. Maybe mothers of daughters are more likely to rejoin the labour market as their child grows up, while mothers of sons are more likely to leave the labour market as their child gets older. And of course, this is just one survey from a particular decade, so we don't know if the same patterns would appear if the study was conducted today. Without a longer follow-up, these questions will remain unanswered. Third, there's heterogeneity, meaning that the effect isn't the same for everyone. Average numbers hide a lot of variation. Some mothers, for example, may have more flexibility in terms of job opportunities or access to childcare than others. The study gives us the overall average, which is interesting and really important to understand, but it can't perfectly capture how the penalty plays out for different subgroups. To be clear, this isn't a problem with the study, but it is important to bear in mind that we discussed the average effect sizes, and this doesn't mean that every family will see effects of this size. Finally, there's the question of causality beyond the first child. The randomization trick used only works cleanly for the firstborn. Once you get into the second or third child, parents may make deliberate choices about timing, spacing, or even whether to try again for a boy, and those decisions can complicate the analysis. So while the evidence for a daughter penalty is strong, it comes with some caveats. It tells us something real and statistically robust, but not universal, timeless, or identical for every family. Of course, it's not for me to say what families should or shouldn't do after having a child. If women want to leave the labour market, that's their choice. The issue arises if gender norms cause women to shoulder a greater proportion of the household burden than they otherwise would. What this research shows is not that daughters are the problem, but that the birth of a daughter can amplify existing expectations about who does what in the home. The daughter penalty is a reminder of how powerful norms and expectations can be. A coin toss shouldn't determine a mother's career path, but in practice it often does. Whether that continues depends less on the children themselves and more on the policies, workplace cultures, and household arrangements that shape how parents respond. If you found this video interesting and want to see more like it, consider subscribing and hitting the bell icon so you're notified when we upload again. Finally, I'd like to give a special thank you to Damien Clark, who's one of the co-authors of this paper. Your feedback on the script was really helpful, and I appreciate you taking the time to read it. If you're an economics student, or just want to get into the weeds of the methodology, I highly recommend reading the full paper. I've left a link in the description below. Thank you all for watching, and hopefully I'll see you next time on Econ Unpacked.